I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Roz Bellamy is an academic associated with the Trobe University in Melbourne. Now, this event is co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, the Hawaii School of Hawaiian Knowledge, the Matsunaga Institute for Conflict and Peace Resolution, the School of Communication and Information, the Departments of American Studies, English, Ethnic Studies, Sociology, and Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies. Roz Bellamy is an academic, author, and editor based in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. In 2022, they completed their PhD research examining the impact of life writing on young LGBTQ plus people's sense of self-identity and subjectivity, which we will hear about today. Roz's memoir, Mood, a Memoir of Love, Identity, and Mental Health, was published in October 2023 by Wakefield Press. I would also point out that if you have questions or comments, these can be posted in the chat, and then we will pass that over to Roz. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to Hawaii and the Center for Biographical Research, Roz Bellamy.
Thank you so much, Craig, and thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here. I've been following your center for such a long time, and I didn't know you were quite at 800 and what was it, talks?
828.
828. I didn't know you were at that many. I clearly haven't watched all of them, but I've now got homework when I get back to Australia. But I'm thrilled to be here. And talking about my research and also the book that I wrote sort of at the same time. So I have this strange relationship between the research work and then my memoir, which I brought along so you can see, also because I waited so long to get a copy of it in my hands that, you know, I'll touch it whenever I can. But yeah, the two projects, I suppose, have a strange relationship. I had a baby as well alongside the two. So I have these three kind of babies, and they have this relationship to one another in that they were all, I guess, gestating alongside one another. And I think today I won't be speaking about the baby who's already made some noises, but I'll speak about the other two and the relationship between my writing and then the writing of my participants. And one of them, there's a quote up there in the presentation title, and this person said, "Living a life that allows happiness to grow," and I'll talk about that. But I just really like that as a sort of basis for exploring agency among the participants in my research. So let's see if I can make this work. Great. Okay, I've got lots of text on my slides. I'm going to kind of speak informally, but it's up there for those who do like to be oriented to something more concrete, particularly around the background to the research. And I'm very happy to make these available as well if anyone wants to look more at the theoretical groundings for it. But here I am in Hawaii, so I'm going to kind of speak a little bit more casually. I hope that's everyone's happy with that. But I was really drawn to doing this after teaching high school English and humanities. And it was for a few reasons, but along the way, I found that the young people I was working with were really interested in something that wasn't being offered in mainstream secondary education. That was that in their English classroom, there were prescribed texts, there was prescribed curriculum, and they did not fit into that. So they themselves were not, what was being prescribed was not what they wanted. And I guess if we were in any other field, let's take medicine as an example, we would look at the prescription, hopefully, and consider whether or not it was working. But in education, that was not the case. And some of my students came to me and asked if they could do different sorts of writing. And time again, I had to keep coming back to the curriculum as my document, my sort of Bible, if you will, and say to them, we need to study this text. However, here's a way that we can sort of stretch the limits of the curriculum. And that's what I love the most about teaching. And it's also why I left teaching, because I found that what I wanted to do was mostly in those spaces outside of what was being prescribed. And one class, which was an advanced, so we have a program in Australia called SEAL. I don't even remember what it stands for, but one of the letters is A for advanced. And these were students who'd been selected to select entry advanced something. And anyway, that class didn't have to follow the curriculum because they were advanced. And so that's where I got to do whatever I wanted and whatever my students wanted. And my wife is an early childhood academic, and I understand a lot about early childhood education. And I kept coming back to this idea of why are we not doing what's holistically best for the child or for the teenager in my case? Why are we not caring about the full picture of who these people are? And I found in that SEAL program that there was space to look at that and to reflect what they were interested in doing. And life writing was something I was doing in my own time outside of teaching. And because I realized so many of them wanted a way to explore themselves and who they were, I wanted to offer them the opportunity to do life writing. And I offered it as much as I could within the school system. And once I realized that there wasn't really space for it, I started thinking more and more about going into research and continuing my own education. And that led me to life writing, and to the work of many of you and people who have been here as well. And I liked the fact that life writing offered an interdisciplinary approach. So two of the academics that I worked with as my supervisors actually came from a health promotion, public health background. So I initially started proposing this as an intervention. You'll see the word intervention in there quite a bit. And that sort of language was there at the start of my PhD research. It was looking at, I suppose, how a scientist would use life writing rather than how someone from a life writing background or a creative background might think about it. So it was all very much about doing some comparisons, about setting up controls, about measuring. I had a quantitative element to the research as well, even though I certainly don't come from a statistics background. And at a certain point, it just hit me that that's not what I was doing this for. I wasn't looking at reductions in depression that could be measured. I was looking at something that was qualitative. And I changed the design at that stage and instead set about doing, so the word intervention sort of stayed in a sense, but it was very different. It was, I'm going to teach young people about life writing because the school curriculum does not have life writing in it in any way. And then I'm going to offer them the opportunity to write what I called narratives and submit them to me. And then I'm going to look at what comes up in those narratives. So that aspect of it stayed throughout, but then the other elements sort of disappeared as I realized that they weren't quite relevant to what I really wanted to achieve through this. Okay, that was a little kind of rambly preamble to give you a sense of like where this all came from. So I'm going to sort of skip through that a little bit. Just I do want to touch on that last dot point there, that I drew on existing research into expressive writing and narrative therapies. So again, coming from more of that psychological and scientific background, and then adapted it so that it would be creative, exploratory, and literary, because any of the existing expressive writing studies tended to be very, very general. They would have people go into a room and give them just a very basic prompt along the lines of write about your last week or your last 3 weeks, and didn't give them any sort of supporting literature or resources or even text as examples. It just sent them off to do that. Pardon me. And then it measured through surveys to see whether their moods and their levels of distress changed. And to me, that sounded kind of strange, a little bit counterintuitive as an anxious person, because if I was sent into a room and given that sort of prompt, it might make me more anxious in a way. And so I designed it quite differently. So I worked with a group of 20 young people who identified as LGBTQ+. There were quite a few different groups of participants I could have worked with, and I picked that group because mental health is so bad. To put it blatantly, there's high levels of distress, suicidality, self-harm in that population. And because I came into this looking at improving mental well-being, it seemed like a really good group, as well as being part of that community myself. So I had strong connections as well. So I recruited young people aged 16 to 20. Recruited sounds so bad in that sense, but I found these people. I advertised through libraries, through schools and teachers. I found many teachers were really interested when they saw that this was a life writing study, because they themselves were writers or strong readers who just were finding that it wasn't reflected. And I ran life writing workshops, and designing workshops in this sense was quite, it felt like quite a big decision of how to do that. It was quite a big, I guess, choice to make around what I would include in that workshop. That was going to include a lot of bias. So I did a lot of looking at my own positionality. So a lot of writing on that too. And then I just tried to keep it as broad and as much as of an overview of different types of life writing as possible. I brought along different collections of essays, memoirs, and other sorts of texts for the young people to look at. And I taught them different aspects of life writing, as well as just discussing it with them. So I kept it very like conversational. For them, I think some of them were there not because of life writing. They were interested in being in a group of other young LGBTQ people around the same age who were interested in writing. Some of them pushed back against life writing, and even though they did it and they wrote the pieces, afterwards I collected survey and other sorts of information about the process, and some of them sort of said, I still like fiction. I said, that's fine, you can write whatever you like. But they, they did it, they participated. And I think there were lots of reasons why they wanted to go to a workshop. Some of them found, some of them weren't out of the closet about their sexuality or their gender identities. And it gave them a really good sort of excuse to come along to a queer group where they didn't have to tell their parents what it was. They could just say they were going to a writing group, which, felt safer for them. Some of the workshops took place once COVID had begun at the start of 2020. So we had to switch to Zoom for one of the meetings. And one of them at one point had to go and sort of mute herself and say, my parents don't know I'm out. I just, I have to go to another room. So it was this nice sort of space for them where they felt, well, I hope safety. I set it up in a way that was to be a safe space. They knew it was for research. Obviously, they'd signed forms to be part of it. They were informed about all the risks, all that sort of thing. But they knew that all of their writing would be de-identified, so they could sort of write whatever they wanted. And for me, as someone who loves reading life writing, it was really, once I started getting their writing in, it was just sort of bliss. It was like, oh, here we go. This is so good. I had this like link that they could submit the work on, and it just started popping in, and it was fascinating. Of course it was. They were 16 to 20 years old. They had a lot to say, as you can imagine. I also started taking notes during the workshops because so many things came up in conversation. Some of the things they talked about in the workshops, they didn't put in their writing, which I found really interesting. So some of them were quite jokey, vulgar to some extent in the workshops. I think excited and carried away being amongst each other. But in their life writing, they were a little bit more either stilted, or there were certain topics that they seemed to either hold back or just didn't choose to write about. And I looked at their writing as performances and as performative acts through the lens of performativity. And there's a long explanation for why, but I'm kind of conscious of time and that you'll have, the opportunity to ask questions too. So I can speak more about that. It was after lots of thinking about how to approach this, but it was around the idea of speech acts and about them putting their name down, putting their identities down on a piece of paper, and what that means in a school system and in a broader society that doesn't make space for people like some of them. So I really looked at what they were doing as a political act for some of them, just engaging and just identifying with this project and being part of it. And that performative side kind of looks at discourses that they were using in their own writing, and whether some of the values and ideologies that came up reified or disrupted societal values. And sometimes it was really interesting to see, without going into too many little it was a huge project, obviously, and there's so many little side areas I could go down. But even just seeing which of the young people, I guess in some ways, I want to say fell victim to certain stereotypes. No problem.
Okay, is that where we were?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
it is.
good.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things I was interested in, the research centre where I did my PhD was the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society. And it's an interesting place to do a life writing PhD. It's certainly not doing it here. And all these books that I feel really at home at, I was surrounded by public health books and psychology books and sociology books. And I was that kind of strange life writing person, which everyone found like a very fascinating project, but certainly not one that anyone else was doing anything similar to. But because I was surrounded by all that literature and that approach to research, I did find it really interesting how much I kept finding out about my participants that these other researchers certainly weren't getting from their forms of research. And it really was an amazing data collection method. And I suppose I say that as a comparative point, not to say, oh, life writing's better, even though it is, but just in the sense that I was looking at survey data for other research projects that I was working on as a research assistant and seeing, you know, stats and then also some open-ended questions and the data that they got from those. And it's dry, sometimes not dry. Sometimes the young people wrote all sorts of things, but it wasn't hugely helpful in my opinion. Whereas this sort of thing gave so much that I came away going, oh, this is really also a PhD in sexual health. It's also a PhD in mental health and in drugs and alcohol consumption, because I got insights into each of those topics. And so I found that really interesting. And whenever I presented on my research to non-life writing people, there was that sense of, ooh, you know, what else could we find out about people through this method? Which I suppose is also a danger as well, you know, because there's a chance of exploitation there as a data method. People put such personal information into life writing that it makes me think of what happened when there was a huge surge in personal essays, you know, decades ago, or a couple of decades ago. And then one population I remember reading about was young women, where, you know, they'd get a small amount of money to put an incredibly personal essay on the internet for sites like Exogene and Yahoo even. And then they'd get this horrible pushback because of something they'd shared, and it became clickbait, and then the young woman would get trolled horrifically, and then there was just no support. So I do think about that as a huge risk of this being used as a research method. I think for me, applying for ethics and that sort of thing was different because I had the teaching background, and I could say, I'm coming to this as a registered teacher and I'm aware of all sorts of risks for my participants. But I think there's certainly lots to be said. There's important conversations.
I don't know why that's happening. It should be fixed again.
Okay, no, that's okay. So you'll see that there's these mentions in my slides around mental and physical health, because that was the framing I came to this with. And because of the research centre I was at, but also the way I presented my PhD, I did want to speak to that, but that is not what I'm focusing on today, which is more agency, subjectivity, and how identity came up in these narratives as well. Okay. So I wanted to put in some of the participants' writing. I'm not sure if I jumped to there. Yes, I did. Okay, so just some of the things that came up in their writing. I'm not sure if you can see, so I'll read it out loud. But the narratives indicated contested spaces around subjectivity, identity, and behavior. And I noticed shifts in participants' use of things like pronouns and ways of identifying and expressing themselves. So because they submitted, some of them submitted maybe one piece at most, some of them up to 5 or 7. Some were really keen beans, definitely how I would have been if I was one of the participants. And they were like, can I also write some extra pieces? So I noticed interesting things for those who wrote more than one piece. I could see some changes happen over time. This is a piece that was written during COVID, once it began. So this participant, Jessie Douglas, and they each self-selected their pseudonyms, said, all this time at home in isolation lets me stay in my place of comfort, of safety, a place to learn how a new name feels, to correct people with love and be met with understanding, and to privately celebrate how it feels to be acknowledged as the person I am and am growing into. And I should pause and say there, this was talking about gender identity. So this person kind of used being in lockdown as an opportunity to explore a different gender and a different set of pronouns. So they said, just as we are selecting the people we let into our spaces to protect our physical health, I get to choose who I tell, get to choose the people that I let into the space where my gender nonconformity is accepted. And then another piece from someone named Ren. So writing this piece made them think of their body in a different way. Normally they saw their body as the enemy, something to be cut down into a bite-sized piece. But when pulled apart, these are feet that keep me upright, hands that connect with the world, a smile that welcomes other people. My body is a vessel that keeps me going, and I am beautiful. And I found that one particularly interesting because it started in the third person and then shifted to the first person. So as you can imagine, analyzing these sorts of pieces as well, there's so many different things that you could look at there. There's, you could do literary analysis, for example, which I did as part of it. And there's lots of different things that you could look at. I'm going to just quickly jump into continuation on this one. So just going along with that idea of capturing what being in a body feels like, which one of the participants refers to, and they explored that a lot in their writing. That included topics like eating disorders, self-esteem and self-judgment, hormonal and bodily changes during gender-affirming transitions, and also disrupting norms about LGBTQ bodies. So this is a longer one. I'll see how we're going for time. Okay, I'll hurry this up maybe, but just to read a little bit of this one. So this was someone, Sophia, a trans woman who participated. She said, they catch themselves doing silly little things that make them smile. It's a hot day and she sniffs her sweat and swears that it's nicer than it was a month ago. Pretty commonly reported effect, not something that she thought she cared about, but nonetheless particularly validating. But the even more interesting thing, their boobs, those words feel much more natural than they once did, perhaps due to some sort of hormonal effect, or perhaps as a result of proceeding on the sacred journey, are starting to feel a little squishy and just a tiny bit sore. So they squeeze their left boob, it feels like, of the tiny amount of development, more is going on there. It's not bothersome, asymmetry is beauty, and they/she smiles. Even though a few months ago, the goodness of boobs was totally in question, everything else about the effects of HRT, about the female body, sounded lovely. Curves, soft skin, greater emotionality. Honestly, it seemed like something out of a fairy tale. How could these things happen? Surely real life isn't this radical. What has she done to deserve such bounty? But breasts, they don't not want, but they don't want exactly either. And then that just adds to the flurry of confusion, to the, is this really the right thing for me thoughts? So she lies in bed, armed with the word processing tool by which the world starts to make sense, squeezes her semi-existent boob and smiles. So I like reading that one out loud. So you can see they're really interesting people, really great writers as well. There's a lot going on there for them. There's so much changing and happening. And I was also conscious while doing this study what was going on politically, not just in Australia, but of course here in the States, which Australia is greatly influenced by. And that's only gotten worse since my research has gone along and since I completed the PhD as well. But I was thinking about that, of course, the whole time. And some of the participants spoke to what was happening politically, others didn't. But of course, I was thinking about that throughout. And even just doing this work felt like not just a political act, because it did feel like that, but also like the sort of research that if it got into the wrong hands would be looked at in a particular way. And I think, so the government changed while I was finishing my PhD, but the previous government, there was just so much in the media constantly about young trans people, and looking at education environments, looking at other environments where I guess where adults were seen to be encouraging young people for thinking about their gender identities. And so I had that sense of sitting on this kind of bounty, to use this participant's word, of beautiful writing that in other hands could be seen as something very, very, I don't know, dangerous, bad, threatening, negative, whatever, any of those words. And I wanted it to not sit in that place. I wrote about it in the way that I felt they presented it to me, which was generously and, just very, very vulnerably. And so I tried not to contextualize it too much around the political and social context, apart from obviously the parts of the PhD where I had to do that. But I didn't want to connect it with all of that risk sort of approach to young people. Okay, so I'm conscious of time, so I won't go too much into these, but there's a lot more that I can speak to on agency. I did just briefly want to talk about, so going particularly with the title of this talk today around happiness. I thought this was an interesting one because it came up in lots of different ways in their writing. One participant spoke about being responsible for his own happiness. So this quote, Nicholas wanted to be happy, and he understood that in order to be happy, he had to live a life that allowed happiness to grow. The only problem was that he had no idea what that looked like, let alone how to achieve it. And I looked at that in relation to that individualized sense of it being on him to figure out happiness rather than there being broader things that were impacting on his happiness potentially. So I looked at things like the It Gets Better campaign and other examples as well that I'll just talk through around discourses. But that idea of the personal, the individual feeling this sense of, oh, what's wrong with me? Like if I look around and everyone else seems really happy, I must be doing something wrong. When in actual fact, for some of them, there were just so many things going on that impacted on that happiness. And so these were some of the things that I wanted to briefly mention. So things like discourses around childhood innocence being used to regulate young people purportedly for their protection, but sort of denying them agency, particularly around sexuality and sex. That their sexualities are often considered through risk-based understandings and moral panics, not anything to do with their rights around self-expression. That LGBTQ lives are associated with risk and vulnerability, and the solutions all tend to be very individualistic, neoliberal and medicalized. Individuals being viewed as queer consumer citizens. Again, that's a whole side topic I could go into, but won't right now. But also, like I was saying with Nicholas, inequalities are normalized as individual shortcomings, which, to quote from Schmitz and Tyler there, absolves government bodies from culpability in social inequalities. So I was very interested in that idea of the individual and the broader contexts that they were coming up against. Okay, my title there is deliberately upside down. First, I made it was a mistake, and then I was like, oh, I actually like that because the title is Transformation of Agency. So I did want, when the computer did that, I was like, I actually quite like that. So just to kind of speak to some of the findings, many of the participants appeared to undergo transformations emotionally, creatively, through life writing as an outlet. And transformation in this study may have involved developing skills to explore and find ways to cope with challenging circumstances and feelings. So that idea of particularly losing agency, and some of them noted that, like when COVID began, some of the sense of ways that some of them kind of talked about being physically trapped at home, or things that they lost access to during that time. For others, it was around their mental health and having to listen to parents, a doctor, a psychiatrist, and writing for many of them seemed to offer a way of regaining agency to some extent. And of course, this was only a temporary little thing in their lives, but I'd like to think that for some of them, they continued doing this sort of writing in some way or another afterwards, because they certainly gained a lot during the process from my perspective. Okay, so some of the ways forward with this work, I was really interested, as I've focused on throughout, with the idea of agency and also fixed selfhood. And I think something I noticed as a teacher was how fixed it was. And that came from, from the very beginning of early childhood and elementary school, with our gender, being here, being back home as well. I see boy-girl stuff everywhere. Becoming a parent now, I'm part of it. I used to complain about it. I'm now part of it. I'm like, where's the boys section? Oh, okay, I'm also going to look at the girls because some of the things are cuter, but it's so pervasive. You can only fight it to a certain extent. It's part of our everyday existence constantly. And aside from gender as well, things around sexuality, today someone assumed that my wife was my son's other mother, and we were so pleased because that's so rare, because most other people don't do that and just, you know, oh, which of you is the mom? And so just it's everywhere. We consume this constantly, and so for me, thinking about the young queer person in a school setting, where they have to choose a bathroom, or they have to, you know, go on school camp and then be in a room with particular campmates, and, you know, listen to things like crushes and that sort of thing and feel awkward, whatever it might be. There's just certain things that are coming up from very young, that if you start realizing that about yourself, even though things have changed, there's still a sense of just being different and being at odds with the dominant, you know, social discourses. So I really like the idea of providing tools and outlets for speaking back to those discourses. And I think obviously young people already do that. You know, queer people go into adulthood and clearly have found ways to get there. But I think in my case, I thought back to what made the difference for me. And it was often teachers where I felt a connection, a kinship, whether or not, you know, they were queer or not, but there was a sense of finding people that I related to and felt safe with when lots of the school system wasn't safe for me. So trying to make writing a space like that for them. And I would kind of go back and forth between the writing that the young people were doing for this, and then what I had to teach, say, 7th to 10th graders. And some of them were studying the same old, very tired texts that really deserve a break at this point, and not getting a chance to do any of the things that they wanted to either write with, play with language, or explore as themes. I really want to look at shifting from those risk-based understandings of young queer people to queer affirming and strength-based approaches. And finally, I wanted to talk about tertiary students. So I found, because I looked at 16 to 20-year-olds experiences, that some of the young people were at university already when they participated, others were still at high school, and there was this really interesting difference there as well. Not always in the way that you would expect. Sometimes the university students, if anything, had more ingrained, I don't know, I guess they'd swallowed the system to an extent for longer. So if anything, they had kind of they were less willing to do exploratory writing, and more like, okay, tell me exactly what to do. Can you give me that really detailed, almost like a rubric of what to write? Whereas the 17, 18-year-olds, some of them were much more willing to be playful still. And so I think looking at university students' experiences would be really interesting. And I put there that in the Australian system anyway, there's I found research around LGBTQ people being denied either citizenship or full participation in university life. Others would argue that there's an overrepresentation of queer rights within the university system, but I think there is that difference still between what's happening in, say, the student unions, or, you know, in the student gathering spaces and the classrooms. There's still quite a distinction there, particularly in certain disciplines like the sciences, the STEM area. So I think that was all the main things I wanted to talk about. And yeah, of course, I want to give time for questions. There's so much more I could talk about on this, but yes, I would love to hear from all of you if you'd like to ask questions.
Thank you very much. And you really have given us plenty of time. That's great. Do we have questions in the chat?
So we have questions in the chat.
You put those up for
I
you.
can also speak more if we're going all the time. I'm just going to have a quick look over my notes.
Well, while you're putting those up, I'll just throw in a couple quick. The first one was, it really struck me because this comes up an awful lot in terms of recognizing agency. What is the system in the international institutional review or permission to research? Because you were saying 16 to 20-year-olds. In the United States, they have to be 18 to be able to get permission to be able to participate in a research. So this comes up in our creative writing program all the time, because we have people who are doing creative nonfiction or are doing nonfiction work, and we have to remind them you can't talk to anybody under 18 unless you have their parents' permission.
Yeah.
So first thing I was just going to ask about is, in terms of your institutional review board, are 16-year-olds able to actually give permission to participate in a research project?
Yes, so we allow younger than that also with parental permission.
Yeah.
But I was able to get the parental permission waived for 16 plus.
Wow.
Because I argued that being this population, particularly for some, it would be unsafe to tell the parent what the research project was. And I just made the argument that with the age of consent being 16, that if they were fully educated about the risks and the uses of the research data, that they could make that decision. Somehow it got through.
Yeah, I was going
Yeah.
I can say, I can think of whole regions of the country where that would never get through here. And
Yeah.
exploded to a major problem. The
Yeah.
other question I wanted to ask about was actually the makeup. It was obviously LGBTQ, but issues of intersectionality. To what degree did issues of race or class or ethnicity, how did those things sort of entwine themselves, and you find what was the sort of overall demographic of the people that you were working with, and to what degree did you see in their writing the way that they were in some ways navigating some of those kinds of issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it absolutely came up. In terms of I can speak to race. In terms of class, that's harder because I didn't get that sort of data from them. So it's only if it came up in their writing. But there was certainly a sense of class coming up around private or public school was one way. Another was the sorts of things they were writing about. You're giving me an idea for a paper here. Where, for some of them, it was about going to work and about the experiences of taking public transit to work and everything that happened on that day. Whereas for others, it was going to a party from their private school and the sorts of houses that they were going to. So there was very much a sense in those respects. Race came up in really interesting ways. I think because COVID started halfway through data collection. So a couple of the participants wrote about racism, being Chinese Australian, some of or for one, being people assuming she was Chinese, making assumptions about her based on her ethnicity. I think it didn't come up before COVID, which was really interesting. And then race came up once it began. I think I started collecting data in November. And so then January, February, things shifted a little bit. Australia has a race problem year round, don't worry, but it only came up really kind of in that really direct way, I think, once COVID began. It might be that the reason I say it gives me an idea for a paper is I think thinking back to the school system as well, that race is erased in our curriculum, and perhaps some of the young people were used to not writing about their race unless it was, for us in elementary school, there's a lot more of that sort of write about your family kind of project. And that just sort of all stops after grade 7. And so I think maybe for some of them, they weren't used to writing about that. I don't know, but yeah, I think it didn't come up in that intersectional way of the conflict between their sexuality for the majority of them. I think for one of them, she wrote a comment along the lines of people assuming she was straight because Asian people couldn't possibly be queer. And so she was kind of like exploring stereotypes there. So it definitely came up. It just, the majority of the participants were presumably, this is white Anglo backgrounds. And so it was only if any of them sort of directly mentioned race that I knew otherwise. The only demographic information I got about them was sort of age, level of education that we're currently at, and really their location, I suppose. And yeah, that was it. In hindsight, I would have asked those questions for sure, but that wasn't really the purview of it.
I was just raising it because that issue of intersectionality, especially in many of these dynamics, becomes such a huge factor. And a lot of the people who are working, we've got a special issue that just came out on Me Too. And
in particular talking about the whole dynamic that the Me Too really took off when you had a white actress in some ways starting it, but the actual debate and the actual notion of Me Too had started years earlier. And that it actually had a different valence depending on the particular factors that an individual was dealing with. That it was, if you were dealing with Me Too, it was different if you were queer, Black, urban, and that those things in some ways steamrollered it so that actually you could have within a particular demographic very, very different notions about what that experience was like.
Yeah.
Given all those other factors. So I was just wondering to what degree that would be the
really interesting.
Especially with the racial and ethnic background in Hawaii, that would be the immediate go-to in terms of having to take that into account.
Yeah, that
And
makes
I know
so much sense.
different.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I know when I started the PhD, I really wanted to look at so many broad areas and populations. And my supervisor said, you need to pick one. And that's how I ended up looking at queer identity. And maybe that kind of is why I funneled myself more in that direction and didn't think as much about that until it started coming up in their writing. I think if I were to scale this up and do another research project, I would absolutely factor all of that in much more explicitly than I did. It was interesting to see how it came up just naturally, so to speak, But during one of the workshops, the young people kind of all got chatting, and some of them had come from the country, like countryside, I should say, and started talking about their school farms. And those who were based in the urban metropolitan area were like, sorry, what? Farm? And had absolutely were blown away by the idea of their schools having farms. And there was just this funny them getting to know each other. Let me tell you about my school. Let me, and you could just see how much our society is segregated in those ways, that there was just very little knowledge of each other's experiences, or should I say that the city experiences are known about, and the countryside ones are not. But I think absolutely, I totally hear that. And I think also because I was looking for young people to participate who identified as queer, those who had more willingness to kind of join in and sign their name to this would have been more, I hesitate to say privileged, but I guess may have had more support, at least institutionally and perhaps parentally as well. And so that would have also really strongly, I think, reduced the diversity of the participants in that respect.
Yeah, I was just bringing it up because, for example, here, the diversity of ethnicity in a project like this would also possibly put you in touch with young people whose ethnic background meant that even if they're in their family environment, there was a very, very different notion about what it meant to be queer, or whether that was even the terminology or whatever. So sometimes it would be somebody could be queer going into a school environment and actually finding a real contrast between what the school is saying about their status as opposed to the kind of support, because usually we go immediately to the notion of it's almost always the young person can't tell their parents because but in some instances it actually works out. There's no problem with parents. It's when they end up getting into school. So that's and that comes up on racial and ethnic and class grounds, and you're going to get a tremendous diversity here with any group of students that you have along those lines.
Absolutely.
So I'm just interested. Anyway,
I have a question for you, just because you spoke about your memoir writing and this research as concurrent projects. If you could speak to how they impacted each other. Maybe what was happening in your own memoir writing that was inspired by your research and vice versa.
Thank you for reminding me. It's right in front of me. I should forget about it. So I mentioned that I was doing a lot of writing during this process. So some of it was what I thought of as formalized memoir writing, and some of it was research notes and autoethnographic writing. Some was more formal than other writing. Some of it was that sort of stuff you scroll because it was a fascinating quote or little observation. And later I realized a lot of that would be really interesting to use when I was writing up what I found. And I think at first I just didn't think of the memoir as being relevant to this project at all. but later realized how much I learnt through what the young people wrote, that helped me understand my own writing process a lot better. And I think I've just always seen creative writing and academic writing as, and this might also be the Australian system as well, might be why I had the sense. Yeah,
I've been an outside evaluator for
Yeah.
PhDs,
Oh my
and I've
God.
come right up against it every single time.
I hate it. I'm going to go strong here. I really I started studying creative writing as an undergrad, age 17, 18. And I probably relate as much to the young people as I do because I went through the system the same way. I loved creative writing. I loved it at home, hated it at school, hated it at university, kept hoping that I would find what I loved and never finding it really, apart from that one odd teacher. That's me, presenting it differently. And our system is just so, you saw what it's like.
Just a real quick thing, if you're writing a creative thesis or a dissertation in Australia, you have to balance it by as many words that are critical and theoretical analysis. So you actually end up having to write two, because they're scared that the students are going to get away with something if they actually get a PhD by writing a novel.
Yeah. So there's no MFA the way you have here. I remember when I first learned about the US style MFA, I was like, wow, the dream. Because what I did as my honors degree, so that was like the year after my undergrad, I wanted to just write and creatively, wasn't allowed to do that. And the exegesis was seriously the bane of my existence, to the point that I didn't do my PhD in creative writing because I would have had to do another exegesis. And I hated it with such a passion. So I think that's why for me, it I had to be reminded that I was going to speak about that, because for me, they are so separate. And I think having the space to explore your creative writing in an institution is marvelous. Don't take that for granted, because for us, it continues to be that way. I won't go into a long rant about why I think it is. I think there's lots of reasons, but that's our system. So I think for me, I just never made the link until I was doing that final write-up, and I was pregnant, hormonal, nervous about finishing, and it just suddenly kind of all started coming together. I was like, my writing is part of this. I refuse to separate it. And thankfully, one of my supervisors was very encouraging about including reflective writing, as he called it, which I think was like a nice, neat side way of connecting the two. And so I started being able to actually embed my own creative nonfiction into my project. And it was just such a pleasure. Like, if I could have just done that from the beginning, I probably would have finished my PhD in about 1 year instead of the 3.5. So I got to embed it, and it's in my final maybe 2 chapters of the PhD. And it feels naughty, because that's not what we're meant to do back in Australia in our systems. It's like, oh my goodness, can I get away with this? So it includes chunks from a little bit from the memoir, a little bit from my own creative nonfiction, just to sort of show for me how I went into creative nonfiction when it's not taught to us, including in my undergrad creative writing degree. That was one subject that was creative nonfiction. Everything else, the closest other subject was fictocritical writing. Everything else was fiction, poetry, novel writing, screenwriting. And as a result, it took me another decade to get back to the right side. Anyway, so I didn't really answer it, I think, very well, but I think what you mentioned about that coming up against that's exactly the feeling. And the feeling that you're going to have to sort of butt heads if you want to do this sort of writing within the systems that we have.
In my experience is it also creates a very odd situation because essentially what it means is somebody has to write 2 dissertations and make sure that that this happened, this is that happened.
Yeah.
So it almost always works out, just because of sheer size. It works out neither one of them is actually big enough to represent a full text. So they both end up too short, and the whole thing ends up too long. And so evaluating it as an outside examiner, it's a matter of, okay, they wrote a biofiction, and then they have to write 150 pages on biofiction. When you then put it together, you realize neither one of these is long enough to be a monograph.
Yeah. Yep. Giving me flashbacks to 2006 when I
Sorry.
wrote my, no, all good.
Life writing is retrospective.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah, my dad recently submitted his PhD at the age of 71. Go dad. And he wrote a play and then, or a script, a film script, and then he had to write the exegesis as well. And getting them to the right word count was just such a nightmare for him. Yes. Anyway, any other questions? I'll try not to rant too much more on that.
We don't have anything else in the chat.
Yeah.
But we have time.
Yes.
I might have missed at the beginning, but they did read each other's, or they asked to read each other's, or was that part of the workshop? Or?
It wasn't actually part of it. That's a great question. I did say to them, like I asked if they wanted me to stay in touch afterwards. Some of them said they wanted to read it after the fact, and I kind of tried to think about the best way for them to do that, because my thesis is so academic, just by design and system, that I sent it to one of them who asked for it and didn't really get a response. And I think my sense is there's probably a better way to collate their stories and share them than my thesis. So I haven't really figured out what that is yet. I only submitted and like passed it the day before my son was born. So that's not happened. But yeah, I think I did say to them at one point that an anthology of their writing or something like that could be really interesting. But yeah. Thanks for reminding me. It's something in the back of my mind about what the best way to present that would be.
Did pop culture kind of jump up for any of them? I know there's a kind of rural urban difference maybe, but did some seem to talk about how they're influenced by whether, famous people in music or whatever it's influenced them or made them feel different about themselves or made them more willing to hear, but I mean, in America, I feel a lot of that age groups, a lot of people in a lot of age groups are very influenced by that, that movie star, that singer or whatever who presents a certain way, and then they feel that
surprisingly not that much. I know for me, growing up in the 90s, it would have been a huge part of this sort of writing, but for some reason they didn't as much. Like they talked about technology, they talked a lot about being on their phones and texting one another, but things like say TikTok and YouTube, like it didn't come up the way I thought it might have, and celebrities didn't really come up that much either. Yeah. I don't know why, but but yeah, the pop culture side of it is interesting to think about. And yeah. But I think for me, one of the things I was really surprised about was just how little nonfiction forms were known by them, even though I know it's not in the school system. I brought in some different memoirs, and for me, I brought in various heroes and put them up, and just none of them had any knowledge of or connection with any of the texts I brought in. And so I don't know. I think I spoke to some teachers also about this and why they thought it's not taught, and some of them said that it kind of made it in only through things like World War II literature, Holocaust literature, but not anything else, which was very interesting too.
Yeah.
they tend to use the excuse they don't have enough time to fit all that in or something.
Or they don't get the say. But then I've been asked by heads of English as well, what should we teach? And I've written up lists and then not heard back. And so I don't know if they've ever taken those on, or if it's they end up deciding they're too busy to do that, or I'm not sure.
You can answer.
Please, yeah.
It was a really interesting story. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you recruited 20 youth, and they write. How often they had a workshop?
So I just did one long workshop with them, which afterwards, because all of this was kind of a pilot study, I learned a lot from it, like about what not to do as well. And like I realized afterwards probably doing maybe 2 different short ones would have worked a lot better, in terms of attention span, in terms of just them being able to commit to coming. So it was one long day. Which was, I think, too long for all of us. But it was still really nice, but yeah, it was quite long. And then they submitted writing before, because I wanted to look at what their writing was like before participating, then right after the workshop, and then I collected it at regular intervals, like monthly times. So then, so altogether it was 5 pieces, but then once COVID properly kind of started and we realized how long that was going to happen for, I applied to extend the study, and then I collected further pieces from those who wanted to. So some of them submitted 7 pieces.
7 pieces.
Yeah, so there's lots of writing.
Yeah.
There's so much of it. Yeah.
So they change the topic, or they keep writing up?
Yeah, so I kept it really general, kind of like those expressive writing studies that I talked negatively about. I did that myself, just because I really wanted to avoid putting my own bias onto it. And I knew if I asked all the things I wanted to ask them, that I just didn't want to influence it as much as possible. So I did the same thing as all these people that have come before me in that sense. And I just asked them to write about their experiences over the last, whatever it was, week, month. So they could choose. And that meant some of them had, like a couple of them had traveled overseas, talked about being in a different environment, what that experience was like. Some of them, it was just here. And I think because it was over the end of the year as well, so our school year's different times. It starts in February and it ends in December. So I started the project around the end of a school year. And that meant that there were parties, there was that graduation kind of season going on. So I think that's why drugs and alcohol came up as much as it did as well. There was a lot of that kind of sense of that social pressure going on. I think if I'd done it, some boring time of year like April for us, we don't have like spring break, we have fall and it's cold and yuck and, no one's doing anything exciting. And so I think it might have been very different as well. But this was like summer and everyone's like out and having fun and until COVID. That changed. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
2 quick questions.
Mm.
To what degree would you describe your work and your dissertation as being autoethnographic?
Mhm.
And to what degree did the participants in your study consider it to be autoethnographic, in the sense of to what degree did you disclose, to what degree did they realize that the researcher was queer? How did that work?
Yes. Thank you all for these questions, because you keep reminding me of things that like I would normally say. And I think, again, I'm going to blame my baby for everything. Normally I would like have started with all of the project itself. But yeah, I didn't do that today. But I was very upfront with them. They knew that I am queer. They knew that I'm a teacher and a writer as well. Some of them asked if they could like follow me afterwards on social media. One of them I've stayed in touch with. She's ended up like working in various like similar writing contexts to me. So I was upfront about all of that from the beginning. I talked about how I might use their data. I didn't really talk about writing myself into it the way I did, because I didn't really plan on doing that from the start. Again, because of the distinction between the research and the writing. So yeah, I think I didn't use the term autoethnography with them, if that's what you meant as part of that. I never used that, but I definitely was very open about being part of the community myself. I also originally, when I was designing this a little bit more as an intervention, I had stakeholders at one point, because I had started it as a participatory research project, quickly stopped that for various reasons, including COVID, including logistics. But I initially had these stakeholders who were people involved in queer organizations, mental health researchers, various people involved in the sector in various capacities, who came along to a day and talked to me about what they thought would be helpful in this research design and project. I included that in my write-up as well, just to show what I took from that, like the bits I was able to incorporate, the bits that I wasn't. But yeah, I think the autoethnographic part of it was later on. So not something I came into it knowing fully myself or understanding how it fit with the project. Does that answer?
Yeah, well, it doesn't seem to me that the really important thing is the label, but for them to realize that you had a stake similar to theirs in the material, because if you get into issues of indigenous methodologies of research or whatever, that issue of stake and positionality is absolutely crucial. And even,
That's the deal breaker.
Mm, mm.
That if you can't demonstrate that the research actually has greater value for the people you're working with than
Yeah.
it does for you, you
Mm.
really shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah,
So,
of course,
Yeah.
yeah.
And one other just nuts and bolts question, because you had some who were in equivalent high school and some who were at university.
Mhm.
How did you actually get the participants? Was there already a pre-existing pool, or
There was no pool.
so
It
was it snowballed, or
snowballed, and
Like a library, you put up just notices or?
I put up notices. I picked friendly areas and organizations. Yeah, I went to libraries, bookstores that had notice boards.
wow?
I started recruiting in 2019, and I feel like things have changed enough in that time that I wouldn't put it up publicly now, which is interesting to say, but yeah, I don't think I would. I think I have more of a sense of the risks, even for me.
Put your contact information with.
Yeah,
on it,
yeah,
and if somebody
exactly.
wanted to harass you, they could.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, not to mention the fact that you've got various groups that are actually fishing that are putting up those kind of notices precisely to
Oh.
identify who might take one of the tickets.
Yeah.
I think we can all breathe a sigh of, look, at least nothing went bad the way it could have, but absolutely, I look at it differently now. Yeah, 2019, a very different time. Yeah, but I was definitely very open with them about my own stake in it, and I think maybe for me having those stakeholders early on helped me feel like it was not just about me and what I wanted to find out, but also I consulted the broader community as well, in terms of justifying what I was looking for at the time, which initially was going to be about promoting mental health, mental well-being. But then later on, it was just I think I talked about being a teacher so that the young people, if they wanted to, could talk about their experiences at school. If we could all go back to our research projects and do them differently now, pretty interesting. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I'm very glad about Roz's presentation. I'm sure they're both our virtual and present audience, so I'd just like to have you all join me in thanking them.